Sister Margaret had been working at St. Catherine's Children's Home for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like the baby who arrived that cold February morning. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, carried the infant wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, her small face barely visible beneath the worn fabric. The baby couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old, with tiny fists clenched and eyes that seemed far too aware for someone so young. Sister Margaret watched from the hallway as Mother Superior spoke in hushed tones with Mrs. Patterson, their conversation punctuated by the occasional glance toward the bundle in the social worker's arms. The other children in the home were older, most between 6 and 16, and it had been years since they'd cared for an infant. Sister Margaret felt her heart skip as she caught sight of the baby's face. There was something ethereal about her features, a peaceful quality that seemed to radiate even in sleep. When Mrs. Patterson finally handed the baby to Mother Superior, Sister Margaret stepped forward instinctively. "May I?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mother Superior hesitated for a moment, studying Sister Margaret's face with the same intensity she brought to all her decisions. Finally, she nodded and carefully transferred the infant to Sister Margaret's waiting arms. The moment the baby settled against her chest, Sister Margaret felt something shift deep within her soul. The child was so light, so fragile, yet her presence seemed to fill the entire room with an inexplicable warmth. As the baby's eyes fluttered open and fixed on Sister Margaret's face, the nun felt tears welling up unexpectedly. This tiny being had entered her life like a miracle, and Sister Margaret knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The baby, whom they named Grace after her serene demeanor, seemed to respond to Sister Margaret in a way that defied explanation. While other volunteers and staff members struggled to soothe her cries, Grace would calm instantly in Sister Margaret's arms, her tiny fingers often reaching up to touch the nun's face with curious gentleness. Sister Margaret found herself volunteering for every feeding, every diaper change, every moment of care that Grace required. During the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the children's home slept, Sister Margaret would sit in the nursery they'd hastily set up, holding Grace and humming old hymns her own mother had sung to her decades ago. The connection between them was immediate and profound, as if they had known each other in some previous existence. Grace rarely cried when Sister Margaret was near, instead seeming content to simply gaze up at the nun's face with wide, trusting eyes that held depths of understanding no infant should possess. Other sisters began to notice the unusual bond, some commenting with gentle humor about how Grace seemed to have chosen her caregiver. Mother Superior observed the relationship with growing concern, recognizing the intensity of Sister Margaret's attachment and the potential complications it might create. "Sister," she said one evening as Margaret sat rocking Grace to sleep, "you must remember that this is temporary. Grace will likely be placed with a family soon." But Sister Margaret couldn't imagine letting go of this child who had awakened something maternal and fierce within her. The thought of Grace leaving felt like contemplating the loss of her own soul. As days turned into weeks, Sister Margaret's world began to revolve entirely around Grace's needs and rhythms. She found herself praying not for guidance or acceptance, but for time. More time with this child who had become the center of her universe, without her even realizing it was happening. As weeks passed, Sister Margaret's devotion to Grace became the defining aspect of her daily life. She rose before dawn to prepare bottles, spent her lunch breaks reading to the baby even though Grace was too young to understand, and often fell asleep in the nursery chair rather than returning to her own sparse room. The other children at St. Catherine's began to notice that Sister Margaret's attention had shifted, though most accepted it with the resilience children develop in institutional settings. Grace thrived under this constant care, growing stronger and more alert each day, her bright eyes following Sister Margaret's movements around the room with unmistakable recognition. Mother Superior grew increasingly worried about the intensity of the attachment, having seen similar situations lead to heartbreak when children were eventually placed with families. She tried gently redirecting Sister Margaret's duties, assigning her to work with the older children or handle administrative tasks, but invariably found the nun back in the nursery within hours. "Sister Margaret," Mother Superior said during one of their weekly meetings, "I'm concerned about your emotional investment in Grace. You must prepare yourself for the possibility that she will be adopted." Sister Margaret's response was immediate and passionate. "She needs me, Mother. Look how she responds to my care. Isn't it possible that God brought her to me for a reason?" The depth of Sister Margaret's conviction was both touching and troubling. Mother Superior recognized the signs of a woman who had discovered a calling within her calling. But she also understood the practical realities of their situation. Foster families were being interviewed, and Grace's social worker had mentioned several promising prospects. The baby's eventual departure seemed inevitable, yet Sister Margaret continued to care for her as if she were her own child, pouring into Grace all the maternal love she had never expected to feel. Each day made the eventual separation more difficult to contemplate, yet Sister Margaret couldn't bring herself to create any distance from the child who had awakened her heart. The first potential adoptive family came to visit Grace on a Thursday morning in late March. Sister Margaret watched from the nursery window as a well-dressed couple in their 30s walked up the front path, their faces bright with anticipation and hope. The woman carried a designer diaper bag, and the man held an expensive-looking car seat. They were clearly prepared and financially stable, exactly the kind of family the adoption agency preferred. Sister Margaret felt her stomach clench as Mrs. Patterson led them into the building, their excited voices carrying down the hallway. Mother Superior had warned her this day would come, but experiencing it felt like watching her world begin to crumble. When the couple entered the nursery, Grace was sleeping peacefully in her crib. Sister Margaret stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, fighting the urge to scoop up the baby and flee. The woman, who introduced herself as Linda, approached the crib with reverent excitement. "Oh, she's beautiful," Linda whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She's perfect." Her husband, David, nodded in agreement, his eyes soft as he watched his wife's face transform with maternal longing. Sister Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. She could see that this couple would love Grace, would provide her with opportunities and stability that a children's home never could. Yet the thought of Grace leaving, of never again holding her during those quiet midnight hours, felt unbearable. When Linda asked to hold Grace, Sister Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the baby from her crib. Grace stirred as she was transferred to Linda's arms, her eyes opening and immediately searching for Sister Margaret's face. The baby began to fuss, her small arms reaching toward the nun with unmistakable preference. "She's just not used to strangers," Mrs. Patterson explained quickly. But Sister Margaret could see the disappointment in Linda's face as Grace continued to cry, refusing to be comforted by the woman who so desperately wanted to be her mother. After the prospective adoptive family left, promising to discuss their decision over the weekend, Sister Margaret found herself in the chapel at 3 a.m, prostrate before the altar in desperate prayer. Grace slept peacefully in a basket beside her, unaware of the crisis her presence had created in Sister Margaret's faith and conscience. "Please, Lord," Sister Margaret whispered into the silence. "Show me what you want me to do. I know I'm supposed to let her go, but every fiber of my being tells me she belongs with me." The chapel's stained glass windows filtered moonlight into colors that danced across the stone floor, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to echo Sister Margaret's emotional turmoil. She had dedicated her life to service and obedience, yet now found herself contemplating actions that went against everything she had vowed. The thought of Grace being raised by strangers, no matter how loving, felt like a betrayal of the bond they had formed. Over the following days, Sister Margaret found herself researching adoption procedures, looking for any legitimate way she might be able to keep Grace. She discovered that while nuns occasionally adopted children, the process was complex and rarely approved by both religious authorities and secular adoption agencies. The requirements were stringent: financial stability, permanent housing, community support, and most orders discouraged such arrangements as conflicting with religious dedication. Yet Sister Margaret couldn't abandon the idea. She began documenting Grace's exceptional response to her care, noting how the baby's health and development had flourished under her attention. She compiled letters from doctors, other sisters, and even some of the older children who had witnessed the remarkable bond between them. In her most desperate moments, she even considered leaving the order entirely, though the thought of abandoning her vows felt almost as impossible as giving up Grace. Mother Superior noticed Sister Margaret's increasingly frantic behavior and called her in for a private meeting that would change everything. Block 6. The Confrontation. Mother Superior's office felt smaller than usual, as Sister Margaret sat across from the woman who had guided her spiritual development for over a decade. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the room, and Sister Margaret could see Grace's basket beside her chair, the baby sleeping peacefully despite the tension that filled the air. "Sister Margaret," Mother Superior began gently, I need you to be honest with me about your intentions regarding Grace." The question hung between them like a challenge, and Sister Margaret realized that this was the moment of truth she had been both dreading and anticipating. "I want to adopt her," Sister Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions beneath her calm exterior. "I believe God brought her to me for a reason, and I can't bear the thought of losing her." Mother Superior nodded slowly, as if she had expected this declaration. "I understand your feelings, sister. The bond you've formed with Grace is evident to everyone here, but you must consider what you're asking, not just of yourself, but of your community and your vows." She leaned forward, her expression compassionate but firm. "Adoption would require you to leave the order. You would need to establish an independent life, find housing, secure employment. Are you prepared to abandon 15 years of religious life for this child?" The question struck Sister Margaret like a physical blow, but her answer came without hesitation. "Yes. If that's what it takes to keep Grace safe and loved, then yes." Mother Superior was quiet for a long moment, studying Sister Margaret's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a complex text. "There may be another way," she said finally, her voice careful and measured. "The Church has provisions for certain exceptional circumstances. If we could demonstrate that Grace has special needs that you are uniquely qualified to meet, if we could show that separation would be harmful to her development, there might be a path forward that doesn't require you to leave your vows behind." Sister Margaret felt hope bloom in her chest like a flower reaching toward sunlight. Block 7. Building the case. Mother Superior's suggestion opened a door that Sister Margaret had never imagined existed, and she threw herself into building a case for keeping Grace with the same dedication she had once brought to her prayer life. She contacted pediatric specialists who could evaluate Grace's development, documented every instance of the baby's unique responses to her care, and researched precedents where religious communities had been granted custody of children under special circumstances. The process was exhausting, but filled with purpose. Sister Margaret felt as though she was fighting for Grace's soul as much as her own. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric psychologist who consulted with the children's home, agreed to evaluate Grace's attachment patterns. Her findings were remarkable. Grace showed signs of what she termed selective bonding, responding to Sister Margaret with developmental milestones that were advanced for her age, while showing distress and regression when separated from her primary caregiver for extended periods. This kind of attachment, while unusual in its intensity, suggests that disrupting the bond could be psychologically harmful to the child, Dr. Rodriguez wrote in her report. The infant has formed what appears to be an essential connection that is supporting her healthy development. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret worked with Mother Superior to research church law and precedent. They discovered that while rare, there were instances where religious communities had been granted guardianship of children whose needs aligned with the community's mission and capabilities. The key was demonstrating that the arrangement served both the child's best interests and the greater good of the religious community's work. They found a case from the 1980s where a monastery in Ireland had been granted custody of a child with special needs whose care became part of their ministry. As they built their case, other sisters in the community began to rally around Sister Margaret and Grace. They had all witnessed the extraordinary bond between them, and many felt that Grace's presence had brought new life and purpose to their home. Even the older children advocated for Grace to stay, writing letters about how she had become part of their family. Block 8. The legal battle. The formal petition to the court was filed on a gray April morning, with Sister Margaret, Mother Superior, and their newly hired attorney presenting a case that was unprecedented in their jurisdiction. The lawyer, Sarah Chen, had experience with both family law and religious institutional matters, and she understood the delicate balance they needed to strike between parental rights, child welfare, and religious freedom. "We're not just asking for custody," she explained to Sister Margaret before their first hearing. "We're asking the court to recognize a new model of family, one where a religious community becomes the extended family unit that supports both the primary caregiver and the child." The opposing side was formidable. The state's attorney argued that no matter how strong the emotional bond, a religious institution could not provide the stable family environment that Grace deserved. They brought in experts who testified about the importance of traditional family structures and questioned whether a nun, no matter how dedicated, could provide adequate parenting without the support of a spouse and typical family life. "This child deserves a real family," the state's attorney argued during opening statements. not to be raised as some kind of experiment in religious community living. But Sister Margaret's legal team had powerful testimony on their side. Dr. Rodriguez presented her findings about Grace's exceptional development under Sister Margaret's care, comparing it to statistical norms for children in institutional settings. Several prominent child psychologists testified about the importance of maintaining established attachment bonds, particularly in the crucial early months of development. Most compelling was the testimony from the other children at St. Catherine's, who spoke about how Grace had brought joy and stability to their 15-year-old Maria, who had lived at the children's home for 8 years, told the court that Grace felt like the baby sister she had never had, and that Sister Margaret's love for Grace had made all of them feel more like a real family. The hearing stretched over 3 days, with testimony that moved even the judge to tears at times. Block 9. The decision judge, Patricia Williams, took 2 weeks to render her decision. 2 weeks during which Sister Margaret barely slept, and spent most of her time in prayer when she wasn't caring for Grace. The baby, now 4 months old, had grown from the fragile infant who had arrived in February into a healthy, alert child whose personality was beginning to emerge. She smiled easily, especially for Sister Margaret, and had developed a laugh that could brighten the darkest moments of anxiety surrounding her future. On the morning of the decision, the courtroom was packed with supporters from St. Catherine's, members of the religious community, and local families who had followed the case in the media. Grace sat quietly in Sister Margaret's arms, her small hands playing with the simple cross that hung from the nun's neck, unaware that her entire future hung in the balance. Judge Williams began by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case and the genuine love that all parties had shown for Grace's welfare. This court has had to consider not only the immediate best interests of this child, but also the long-term implications of our decision for both family law and religious freedom, she said, her voice carrying the weight of the momentous decision she was about to announce. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, I find that the bond between Sister Margaret and Grace represents a genuine primary attachment that serves the child's best interests. Sister Margaret felt her heart stop as the judge continued. However, I also find that the petitioners have not adequately demonstrated that their proposed arrangement can provide the stability and comprehensive support that this child will need as she grows and develops. The courtroom was silent as Judge Williams explained that while she was not awarding custody to Sister Margaret and the religious community, she was also not immediately approving the adoption by the prospective family. Instead, she was ordering a 6-month supervised transition period during which Grace would remain at St. Catherine's while a more comprehensive evaluation was conducted. This will allow us to assess the child's ongoing development and give all parties time to address the concerns this court has raised, she concluded. Block 10. The 6-month trial. The 6-month probationary period became the most intense and scrutinized time of Sister Margaret's life. Every interaction with Grace was documented. Every decision about her care was reviewed by social workers and child development specialists. The religious community had to demonstrate that they could provide not just love and stability, but also educational opportunities, social development, and preparation for Grace to eventually integrate into the broader world. Sister Margaret threw herself into meeting every requirement and exceeding every expectation. She enrolled in early childhood development courses, worked with specialists to create comprehensive care plans, and documented Grace's progress with scientific precision. The other sisters rallied around the effort, transforming parts of St. Catherine's into a model childcare facility that impressed even the most skeptical evaluators. Grace continued to thrive, reaching developmental milestones ahead of schedule and displaying the kind of secure attachment that child psychologists considered ideal. She had learned to crawl and was attempting her first words, always reaching for Sister Margaret when she was upset and settling immediately into the nun's familiar embrace. The prospective adoptive family, Linda and David, remained committed to taking Grace if the court ultimately decided against the religious community. They visited regularly during supervised sessions, and while Grace was polite with them, she never showed the same natural ease she displayed with Sister Margaret and the other sisters. Dr. Rodriguez continued her evaluations, documenting not just Grace's attachment to Sister Margaret, but also her growing bonds with the other children and sisters at St. Catherine's. Grace is developing within what we might call an extended family model, she wrote in one report. She has primary attachment figures, but also secure relationships with multiple caregivers who provide consistency and support. As the 6 months progressed, Media attention intensified, with the case becoming a symbol of broader debates about family structure, religious freedom, and children's rights. Block 11. Public support and opposition. The case captured national attention as it became a flashpoint for larger cultural debates about family, faith, and children's welfare. Supporters organized prayer vigils outside the courthouse, while critics argued that the case represented dangerous precedent that could undermine traditional adoption processes. Sister Margaret found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, with reporters asking for interviews and advocacy groups rallying to both sides of the issue. The Catholic Church initially remained neutral, but as public support grew, several prominent bishops issued statements supporting the right of religious communities to care for children in exceptional circumstances. Throughout history, religious communities have served as families for those who had no other options, Cardinal Martinez stated in a widely reported press conference. This case asks us to consider whether that tradition might still have relevance in our modern world. Opposition came from traditional family advocacy groups who argued that allowing religious institutions to adopt children would open dangerous loopholes in established child protection systems. Every child deserves a mother and father, argued spokesperson Jennifer Wall. Religious life, however dedicated, cannot substitute for the stability of a traditional family structure. The most powerful support came from unexpected sources, former residents of St. Catherine's who had grown up under the care of the sisters and returned to testify about the love and stability they had received. Many were now successful adults with families of their own, and they spoke passionately about how the religious community had provided them with values, education, and emotional support that had shaped their entire lives. Social media campaigns on both sides of the issue generated thousands of posts, with Your Grace and Sister trending globally as people shared their own stories about unconventional families and the many forms that love and stability could take. Sister Margaret tried to shield herself from most of the attention, focusing instead on Grace's daily needs and continuing development. But she was aware that their private story had become a public symbol, carrying hopes and fears that extended far beyond their own situation. Block 12. The final resolution. On a crisp October morning, exactly 8 months after Grace had first arrived at St. Catherine's, Judge Williams reconvened the court for her final decision. The courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere felt different. More hopeful, more settled, as if the community had already begun to accept what was about to be made official. Grace, now 9 months old and sitting confidently in Sister Margaret's lap, looked around the courtroom with curious eyes, occasionally babbling contentedly and reaching for the simple wooden cross that she had claimed as her favorite toy. Judge Williams began by summarizing the extensive evaluations that had been conducted during the probationary period. Grace's development had been exceptional, her attachment patterns healthy and secure, and the religious community had demonstrated not just their ability to care for her immediate needs, but their commitment to supporting her growth into an independent adult who could choose her own path in life. This court has been asked to make a decision that goes beyond the immediate welfare of one child, Judge Williams said. We have been asked to consider whether our understanding of family and child welfare can expand to include models that, while non-traditional, may serve children's best interests in specific circumstances. The judge acknowledged the valid concerns that had been raised about religious institutional care, but noted that the extensive oversight and evaluation process had addressed most practical issues while preserving the clearly beneficial relationship between Grace and Sister Margaret. Therefore, Judge Williams announced, this court awards permanent custody of Grace Elizabeth to St. Catherine's Children's Home, with Sister Margaret Collins designated as her primary caregiver within a community support structure that this court finds adequate and beneficial to the child's development. Sister Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as the courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Grace looked up at her with those same trusting eyes that had first captured the nun's heart, reaching up to touch her face with the same gentle curiosity she had shown as a newborn. The baby who had arrived as a temporary placement had become a permanent part of their family, validating Sister Margaret's faith that some bonds are truly ordained by divine providence. Epilogue. 5 years later, Grace celebrated her 6th birthday surrounded by the extended family that had fought so hard to keep her. She was a bright, confident child who moved easily between the structured routine of religious life and the normal activities of childhood, attending the local elementary school, playing with friends from the neighborhood, and participating in the same activities as any other child her age. Sister Margaret had evolved into a role that had no traditional name. Part nun, part mother, part educator, but which felt as natural as breathing. She had maintained her religious vows while adapting them to include the responsibilities of raising Grace, creating a model that the church had officially recognized and that other religious communities had begun to study and sometimes adopt. Grace called her Sister Mama, a title that perfectly captured their unique relationship, and she understood that her family was different but no less loving than traditional families. The children's home had thrived under the attention the case had brought, receiving donations and support that allowed them to expand their programs and serve more children. Many of those children had benefited from Grace's presence, learning about family and love from watching the bond between her and Sister Margaret. Most importantly, Grace had grown into a child who radiated the same peace and joy that had first captured Sister Margaret's heart in that February morning so many years ago. She was living proof that love, in all its forms, could create families that might not fit traditional molds, but could still provide everything a child needed to flourish.